I am an oyster mushroom grower for indoor cultivation. And what I have here is something a little unique. I'm doing my oyster mushrooms on spent coffee grounds. So, Steve, can you, I don't see my picture on there. Can you go to the next slide to see if pictures come up? Okay, well, let's go back to the other one. And I'm not sure why there's no picture on the first one, but let's go over about the mushrooms here. And, okay, let's see. Advance, please. So Steve is having to actually advance for me on this format, and I apologize to people that I can't do that. But I started Firefly Farm in 2015, and my interest has been in finding something to do in the next stage of my life as my children are aging out of the household here. So crops that I have are rhubarb, strawberries, and raspberries, and I became very interested in mushrooms, so I went on to that. What you see in this slide is a plastic storage bin that's full of basically three types of oyster mushrooms here. The from clockwise from the top right corner, there you have your straight Italian, or I'm sorry, your grade of. Then it goes down to chestnuts, those two large orangey clumps, and quite a few of the rest of these are various grade of. And so then the next slide. So oyster mushrooms, I found, were just really very interesting. And I went to a farm market one time and met Michael Burns from Cayuta Sun Farms at our local winter farm market in Corning. And he was selling shiitake logs and promoting a book, Farming in the Woods. And Michael is very, very persuasive when he speaks passionately about things like oyster mushrooms and log growing. So I thought, well, I'll buy one of those and see what's up. I became really interested in that, so I bought the log, purchased the book, signed up for Camp Mushroom, went online to sign up for beginning mushroom camp, grew oysters on a TP kit, which was a fascinating process, and in the closet there of the bedroom. And well, I found that they tasted a little bit like toilet paper, but I love to watch them grow, and I was absolutely hooked. So that's the why to grow mushrooms. Next is the why not. Next slide, Steve. So they are challenging, and there's a lot of competitors in an indoor environment that are more regulated in an outdoor environment than they are on the indoors. And growing on coffee grounds, it's really wonderful environmentally. But when I was looking around to figure out how to do that, because as I tried to do it, there's a little bit in books here and there that I did find, but there wasn't much actual literature out. And so I would have different types when they would grow well, and they tasted very good. So it was worthwhile just continuing that process. But then I would suddenly have a great failure because of contaminants and trichodermas, or it might get overhydrated and become anaerobic. So there was a need to find a better way to do this than just trying out, doing a little trial and error with baking soda or gypsum or table salts. So with the lack of clear information out there and the need to become successful time over time, I then thought, why don't I try this with just baking soda and get it to more of an actual trial basis? And that's where I became into the SARE grant. Next, Steve. So here's a lot of the reasons to grow them on coffee. One of the great motivators is the fact that it intercepts waste products. And in this case, the big one is intercepting coffee grounds at the source where they're produced. Because when coffee grounds go into a landfill, they end up doing an anaerobic conversion into methane, which is quite a bit more environmentally unfriendly than the carbon dioxide that's produced from actually growing the mushrooms. And one of the great byproducts from growing mushrooms is you get wonderful compost to add to your gardens or your small fields if you're a small farmer as well. This is a slide with gray dove mushrooms, and in this case I had actually cut and pulled the top of the bag down to show the mushroom itself. Initially I was growing in buckets, and that was both a lot of fun, but as Steve had mentioned, a lot of labor costs are in there. And the second part of that is that as the mushroom mass goes to its third fruiting, it shrinks so far away from the bucket that it can't come through the holes. And with coffee grounds, we have an initial first flush that produces the most thick mushrooms or durable mushrooms. And then the second one, the mushrooms will be a little bit thinner. But coffee will continue to fruit over a several month time frame. And that can be one of the drawbacks of coffee. And it can also be one of the benefits if you're looking for a longer time span and just having a few bags around. But as far as growing in the buckets, it really was very challenging. So can we go to the next one, Steve? So the biggest problem with coffee grounds is they really are picky, pesky, and petty. This is a photo of Trichoderma, and I'm not sure if you can enlarge it all on your screen. It didn't enlarge very well for me, but you see the white parts there, and the white is where the oyster mushroom is growing. But then there's a lot of green patches, and over amongst those white patches, they're getting covered in green as well. And that's just one of many Trichoderma species that are here, and they're everywhere around us. They're in the air we breathe. They're commonly called a breath mold. They're just everywhere. So if things aren't sterilized properly, or if a person doesn't take good care with contamination and bringing in contaminants while inoculating, then a lot of Trichoderma can be grown. So when I would have my successes, I'd have a lot of mycelium growing well, and when I'd have my failures is when the Trichoderma would come back to visit. Now, I had a lot of support from the community and local restaurants, really encouraging me to find a way to make this happen time over time, because there's nothing like the dismal failure of everything turning green, and then the wonderful success of everything turning white and all these great mushrooms coming along. Because as Steve had mentioned, people love these mushrooms. They really do. So the SARE grant provided me the push I needed, because I needed to go and complete that. Once committed, it really has to be completed. And it became very, very dismal last year with continually growing a lot of Trichoderma. But what I had needed to do was to create very separate environments that have their dedicated footwear and the dedicated type of clothing, so that it became quite easy to replicate. Next, Steve. So on the right is one of the main tools that I have to help create a reproducible result time over time. And it may be just as simple as having clean shoes in each one of the rooms you work in. So Willie Crosby once had mentioned that before entering a room, you need to step in to a tray of isopropyl. Well, it's not really conducive for my setting for that. So the easier part for me was just to get 3 pair of plastic shoes that would be very comfortable and no slip on concrete floors. And that's what I have for that. So procedures were developed on this farm to be clear, concise, and easy to follow. And sanitation really is in the details. So when I go in, I don't walk in with my shoes or even with my bare feet. I slip my shoes off, step straight into the room with these or something similar, and continue going. And if I'm going to be stepping then into the inoculation room from that, well, I have a spray bottle of isopropyl that I can mist my feet and ankles alone and my hands and my wrists before I suit up. So that can work out quite nicely. I also was charged myself with developing a recipe that was going to work. And I think I've hit on something that can work for everybody. So if people try this, it'd be great to get back to Steve or myself and let us know how it's working for you. Now let's go and look at the process here. So next, we have the benefits of growing indoors. Well, outdoors, we're much more at the mercy of the weather and limited by the seasons. So indoors, we lose those issues. We become a four-season, we control the environment, and it can be turned on or shut off. For example, I'm going to be going away for 19 days. Well, I don't want 19 days of fruiting mushrooms that'll be bringing and being a host for fungal gnats, creating a lot of spore and having to scrub out a room. But I can drop the humidity down to around 25%, or basically the ambient of whatever the outdoor may be, and just shut it off completely. And the blocks in general will stop fruiting because as the pinning occurs, it finds that it doesn't have enough moisture in general that it'll just stop. So if we have a very moist time while I'm gone, well, it'll still pin, and I'll have to send in my number one helper there, my son, to go and pop off all those so he doesn't have to harvest mushrooms. The biggest problem I have with indoors is this little guy here that you see. Now this is an Italian brown oyster mushroom, and the fungal gnats are just a problem. You see an exploded view, and if you've seen the backside of gills, then you can have an idea that these guys aren't that big, but they're still really annoying. And they could carry contamination from one block to the other. So if there's problems with Trichoderma or other diseases, they simply like to go and share alike to everybody. So next we have the ins and outs of growing indoors. Next slides. So each step needs its own separate location. So we have, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 basic steps in growing. And with the indoor, we end up with a little bit more complexity to that than the outdoor, because once we procure our raw materials, then we need to mix those. Whereas with log production, you procure your logs and then you need to take and inoculate them. But with this, there's a mixing process and a bagging process. Then we have to sterilize them. And after that, there's the inoculation, the spawn run, fruiting, and then we can't forget they have to be harvested when they're ready, because they don't like to sit around, and that requires refrigeration. So a workflow is really important to reducing contamination. You have to think on the microscopic level of this in order to be able to really delve into it. And sometimes it's as easy as looking in the refrigerator and trying to figure out, how did the microbial gang get to things? Well, it'll get to the things in the refrigerator the same as it'll get to anything else out there in your operation. So basically, hitchhikers are completely unwelcome. Once you get to the point of sterilizing, after that, the emphasis is on not letting non-target items come into your inoculation or fruiting room. Next. Now we have the coffee grounds and sawdust. And don't forget the baking soda. That ended up being the sweet spot. As I'd mentioned before, 2 books had just really small references to using baking soda, and there was really very little I could find online either for what to use with coffee grounds. Some sites said, well, you just keep putting your coffee grounds in and you layer that with mycelium, and look, you get these wonderful mushrooms. But the fact is that the air in my house is not sterile. So if I make a pot of coffee and think, all right, I've ran hot water through my grounds, they should be sterile. And then I throw them into a container thinking that, all right, I can just accumulate them there. But in the process, we go through transferring past air and oftentimes moving air. And that air contains everything that you can not imagine, but it has all types of little spores and items that love the nutritional coffee grounds. So to get the raw materials, except for the baking soda, which is simply a purchased item, and I believe this is the only company that really has baking soda. So I couldn't find a generic one. Coffee grounds, set up a relationship with a local coffee shop that really would love to work with you. It's a real win for a coffee shop if you can take away their coffee grounds consistently, timely, and they'll love it because otherwise the coffee grounds go into the garbage bags, and it's very common for the garbage bag to break as they're carrying it out to the trash bin, and oftentimes in front of customers. And then there's everything you don't want your customers to see on the floor, including coffee grounds getting spilled over on shoes. So this particular place I work with, they're just thrilled to death to see me come in, especially if they're having quite a banner 3 days, and I come in with my buckets, like, oh, we are so glad to see you. We've been wishing for the last 2 hours to see you. Even though they can always call me and let me know, everybody's very polite back and forth, so they don't. It works well for my coffee shop and me. They put things in these buckets. I bring them back clean buckets. There are lids that go on them. But rest assured, these are contaminated with everything under the sun that people have around them all the time in the air. The second part here is sawdust. These are big. Now, to give you a scale, if you have a minivan, which some of us have had, especially when we've had children, 2 of these will fit side by side in a minivan. If you put a third one on top, it can be shoehorned in there with enough of the guys that are always throwing lumber around at the mill, but to get it out can be extremely tricky. So I've said, guys, we can never do this again, only 2, because side by side, they are smacked up against each other and take a substantial height in the back, and they're very heavy. So the length of that goes from the back of the trunk all the way through, and I have to generally pop up the seat so it covers part of the back seat as well. So only 2 people can travel in the minivan. I have to pay a whopping $10 for each one of these. And as I said, they are heavy. It takes 2 of us to drag one out, and then we just roll it down the hill and get it in place so it can be used. Easiest to have, again, another part of sanitation. Even though it's outdoors and everything gets around, the last thing I need is a bunch of soil and greens popping up into this. So to see what I'm doing, I have white cloth, shade cloth down, and that works out well, or white roll cover. So the last part, again, is just getting my little bags of white powder that they're put into snack bags. So my kids give me a lot of grief on what am I doing with these 120-gram white powdered bags. Fortunately, they've never tried to slip one off as a funny to school. Otherwise, I think I'd be called. But they do look very much like something that you would get in trouble for if you were hanging around with those. Now, another thing, though, to talk about with the coffee grounds and working well with the folks at the coffee shop. So when I have excess mushrooms, I bring them in there and give them away, and they love that. And if I start getting straws, tea bags, tea envelopes, milk caps, and things like that in there, then it's a friendly reminder that, well, do you really want to eat one of those? Because the mushrooms don't like eating them. And then they go through and do a much better job at keeping the grounds clean because they like to eat really lovely mushrooms. Now, I'm going to try to answer questions at the end, but I'll look through a little bit here right now to see what we have going on. Let's see. Okay, we have, do you use the flavored coffee grounds as well? Well, I use whatever coffee grounds they put in there, and I don't believe they have any type of flavored coffees they do. They put coffee flavorings in later. After having the coffee with the hot water run through it, all the flavor would be gone. And even though they're not organic coffee grounds for the most part at this place, by the time all that's extracted, pretty much so anything that might have been in that coffee to begin with is extracted. But because I don't have an organic source, I cannot be labeled organic. But as I just said, in my mind, if you're flushing it with that amount of hot water, probably anything that might be offensive is gone. Another question here is, okay, we will be discussing the ratios and the secret sauce recipe here. And I do not use hardwood fuel pellets. I'm really into trying to intercept waste products. So in the case of the sawdust, that is coming from a local mill that if nobody comes to get those bags, then they have to go into the landfill. But typically, enough people come to get them for bedding materials that then they just end up being able to go away that way. So if not enough people come, then they just become part of the waste stream again. I don't like to intercept carbon that is going into a system that can either be worked back into the land typically, or would typically be used for heating already. I also don't know quite what the cost would be for that, or how it would be to rehydrate the pellets. The species that I use it's an oak hardwood that's local to our region, and they use all oak there. And I ask for the kiln-dried sawdust, the sawdust that comes off of the kiln-dried lumber, because then I know I'm getting something very consistent. It's probably less likely to have hitchhikers in it that are going to start the rotting process of the sawdust when the bags get moist, because invariably in handling something with that amount of weight, little tears and holes happen. And then as it begins to change in color, well, it's already breaking down, and I need all those carbon chains intact for the mycelium, because the mycelium really needs to be the primary consumer here and not going along and trying to deal with the fact that some things have been broken down. Let's see, how do I develop the relationship? Call around, look around, see who's local to you, make friends. That's the best way. And there's this, maybe this is naive, but To what extent should we be concerned that pesticides, herbicides, fungicides, or residue on beans from coffee shops, unless they're 100% organic, are transferred to the fruiting bodies? I think I pretty well went over that with the fact that we can really get things flushed out. And I see that you're referencing the folks at Grow Cycles. And maybe we can get back to something that they do with things there later. Try to remind me at the end. All right. So next slide here, we're going to go on to the spawn. So it comes in little bags, and you can get either sawdust or grain. There you're seeing 4 bags of grain spawn. For me, when I'm mixing into this, I found it just so much easier to handle grain than to handle the sawdust. And the reason for that is that it's much easier for me to break apart the grain than it is to break apart the sawdust. And especially if the bags have been around a little longer than I might have wanted because of interruptions in the workflow, then they might start to want to fruit themselves. With the grain spawn, it's much easier for me to manage something that has grown into itself than with sawdust. And the more points of inoculation I can get going on this, then the happier things are. There's a lot of suppliers out for this. I found that the supplier I use, they've gone to an ISO 100 facility and created a whole new facility, and my yields doubled from just that, which then made me realize that even though I wouldn't see it in there and I wouldn't see it later, there was definitely small amounts of contamination that were eating the food and keeping the target fungi at bay. But I've been really impressed and happy with their new operations. So quality spawn's really important. And if you see any contamination ever in a spawn bag, then it's everywhere in that spawn bag. So it becomes unusable. But any reputable places, if you've had your spawn just for a few weeks and you begin to see something grow, they'll replace it. If you've languished it for 2 months, well then perhaps you need to look at your workflow. Sometimes I really have to. Okay, next slide. I'm looking at a question here. It says, what do you have them store coffee grounds in, and how often do I pick them up? Well, in this case, for the location I work with, I have 15-liter buckets, and these were old frosting buckets that I took home and I cleaned, and they have lids. Then these are square ones, so it works nicely to nest them together underneath a counter. And this place likes to get 3. 4 doesn't work into their flow because they don't have the space for 4. 2 is not enough because then I have to come by every other day. And so 3 makes it really well, really nicely balanced for both of us, that I can come in twice a week, sometimes a third time, depending on how the schedule's going and how their consumption's going, and trade out new buckets. So now here's what everybody is probably most interested in. Here's the secret recipe. And this is being recorded. This is part of the SARE grant. This is now public knowledge. So it's no longer secret as of a few seconds ago. So I've tried mixtures of 25, 50, 75, and 100% coffee grounds. And by the converse, then there's that amount of sawdust. I've tried growing in buckets, and I've tried growing in bags. The bags work much better for me to manage, and especially from trying to keep things sterile and clean. So the other part, though, that seems kind of interesting is why am I picky about the 120 grams of baking soda? Well, because if you go way over that and just eyeball things or think that I can kind of evenly measure out 2 tablespoons per 15-liter bucket. The next slide here, Steve, will show autoclavable spawn bags. And this comes down to what works well for your operation. I had been getting the one on the left, the smaller ones, from my spawn supplier, and thinking, okay, this seems to be the right standard size to use. But always having a real challenge tossing around the spawn in there to get it evenly mixed. And if that doesn't happen, then the spawn cannot grow out into the media fast enough. Because no matter how well I've tried things, eventually I do get a little bit of hitchhiker in there, and sometimes things go horribly bad, and I know I have to really clean out my inoculation room again and go over the checklist of what I'm supposed to do. So the larger bags on the right work really well for me. Some of the parts that are so good about this is that I got seconds bags, so they cost me substantially less than the ones on the left, which were firsts. And I only have to handle 3 per steroclave instead of 4. So that automatically reduces my handling time of things by 25%. But not only that, it increased my speed at being able to handle things because of the frustration of trying to mix things and the time that it took me to mix the spawn into the sterilized media really worked out nice. So you get to fill your bags here and choose what you like. So anytime you can reduce costs, please do. The next slide is about becoming a bag woman or a bag man. So on that slide, Steve, I have the filling here of the bags. So on the left, there are 2 bags that are filled, and these get to be pretty heavy. So I simply have found that an 8-cup glass Pyrex filled to the top, push down lightly, toss 3 of them into a bag here. I'm ready to go. And I used to have to weigh out how heavy they were, especially when I was doing the actual data collection and looking at the data to see how different mixtures were comparing. But now, when it's for my own stuff, for the on-farm part now, it's much more by eye and feel. I know that this is right, or if I don't close up the bags right away and use them right away, they can actually reduce in moisture. And when I'm picking it up, it's like, this feels too light. I'm going to add a little moisture to it before I throw it in the steroclave. The next part is, what are we going to do with these bags? So let's see, take it to steroclave here. And this is both where high, medium, and low tech come into play. Most folks can recognize that we have an old barrel, a plastic barrel that my contractors cut in half because they did not like how dirty I was getting the walls sometimes there from the steroclave when I would vent them. In that way, if there's coffee that gets awry and it sputters out, it sputters on to those containers, and I can take them out and rinse them off easily. But these are 2 steroclaves, and they are identical. You'll see an orange tag and a yellow tag. They're now both yellow tags because the orange tag was from a newer one and had gone under as many heat cycles and lost its color. And they don't look pretty and shiny anymore, but they still function very well. I put mine on stands because it made everything much easier to utilize for me. If you're local to the southern tier and come to the Corning area at any point in time, I recommend, if you're going to use a steroclave, to get this one product, and it's the only product that I know that's available for this, but these run best with using the high vacuum grease. You can use Vaseline, but that's a lot more challenging. And you can buy this online and pay a huge price for having a hazardous material sent to you in the mail. This is a little stiffer than the consistency of Vaseline. Also, you can apply it with your finger if you want, according to the directions, and the hazmat sheet has very little on it. I still use a disposable glove that I keep over there for this purpose. It's very cheap to buy at the one place down here in Big Flats that sells it, and you can just swing by and get up a tube or two and bring your ST-125 so you don't even have to pay tax. So that's one of the nice little tidbits that hopefully if you do go with the part of heat processing, to do that. Now, I'm doing sterilization because pasteurization just didn't work for me. It was far too challenging for me to both watch the pot and then to be able to utilize what's there, getting it to just 180 and holding it for a long time, to having it time over time not end up with a lot of trichoderma. And trichoderma is just the big green monster in this business, and it's nice to keep that guy somewhere else. He can be out in the fields, in the soil, in the compost, any of those great places, but not in my inoculation and fruiting room, please. Now, I use 2 because that allows me to actually get a production setup that works for me. If for some reason I was to feel that I needed more than 2, then it's prudent at this point in time for me to look at other methods for sterilizing. But the size of my operation, this works really well. Are there any questions at this point? Okay, the next point, or the next slide that I'm going to show you is going to be a fashion statement. Now, after you're done giggling and laughing, I was wearing a pair of yellow pants there with a blue top. So this is just a lovely nylon suit that they're inexpensive to buy. They're washable. They'll get really stained with coffee, and it washes right out. There's a hood to keep my hair back because I have a lot of hair, and I have fairly, well, shoulder length hair. Also, another item that kind of is silly, but ends up being really important because our lungs have a lot of hitchhikers with them. Also, we don't want extra hitchhikers into our lungs either. So this mask protects me and it protects the mushrooms. It's a real two-way thing. Make sure to do that. Now look on the bottom and you're going to see a pair of shoes. These shoes are only worn in the inoculation room. I have a pair that I wear only in the sterile-clave room, which was the previous slide. And one of the things that I did when I was first doing the sterile-claving is I'd walk in with my stuff, load up the sterile-clave, walk out, and then every week it's like, wow, this floor just gets filthy. And then I walk in and I'd inoculate, and it's like, this floor doesn't get too dirty, but there's still all this stuff in it. What am I doing with a positive pressure room if I'm going to go and be walking in with dirty feet? Well, even walking in from the one spot and trying to put on new shoes in the other still left too much tracking in. So hence the 3 pair of shoes. And I do look silly, and the kids have laughed me out of house and home sometimes, but it's the way to go. After that, you can add the spawn. I'm holding a spawn bag here in the slide you're looking at, a measure cup, something to open that with, and a stainless steel table. A wood table didn't work out. It just didn't work out. It's not durable at all on any finish that you can put into it, but the stainless steel table is the way to go. And behind me, you can actually see into the fruiting room. So the next slide here, I have taken and set up for you 4 bags in a row. The first one is how the bag looks. I plop 6 of them on the table because everything's done in batches of 6, and it works out well for me again. When I put them into to cool down after I've had them sterilized, I found it really important to have a large container to put them in, a large plastic bin with a tray on it, inverting them and letting gravity try to pull the moisture away from there if there's any excess moisture. And sometimes I overshoot and there's quite a bit, but it's better to undershoot slightly and have either no moisture or just a little bit come out. When using 3 tablespoons or 180 grams of 3 tablespoons per bucket or 180 grams of baking soda per 4 buckets, gravity didn't have the ability to remove enough moisture, and then the bottom would get up to an inch layer of anaerobic activity happening, and that is just an absolute disaster throughout time. So the left slide, I've got my little high-tech rubber band keeping things together. I've actually done a number of little steps in here to keep things moving happily. The next slide, you can see a whitish mass on the more towards the right of it. Oh, go back 1 slide, Steve. So we're going from left to right on these bags. The next one has a whitish mass, and that's actually the individual grains that I put in 2 cups of myceliated grain. Now that has to get shaken around, and it first was sealed and shaken. Now I feel it's pretty evenly distributed, but then another important step is to pack it down a little bit, because as Steve goes on in some of his talks, he'll tell you about how the mycelium has to go from point A to point B, and the longer the bridges that it has to create, the more energy is used. We want as much energy as that mushroom can utilize to be put into creating a fruiting body that we can enjoy eating ourselves or that we can send off to market. So here we're all set. I've got bags on the far right that I want to put in a rack. So now we get to shelve them. And the next slide here shows all the shelving going on. And when we don't mix well, if you look on that slide, if you can look down to the bottom, to the far right, not the farthest right one, but the one just to the left, and you'll see a huge area that is not getting overtaken by the mycelium. I did not get things distributed in that one well enough. That is going to cost me money, and it's going to cost the mushrooms energy. And so that is an unfortunate thing. Now, on the bottom here, those would have been going for about a week and a half probably, and the next one up about the same. The 2 shelves above that probably for about 2 weeks, and the top 2 shelves about 2.5 to 3 weeks. That top shelf is really ready to go into the fruiting room. So that can give you an idea of that. At about 4 weeks' time, they're going to look very white. They might have different liquids on there that are yellowish or golden. Not to get excited about those. The metaboloids, oftentimes they're fighting off a little bit of something here and there for whatever reason. Who knows what all their secrets are. They tend not to kiss and tell. Now the respiration, it creates heat. Just like when we respire, we give off a lot of heat. And we have a lot of heat tolerance range, but our top heat tolerance range is around 104 to 106. And if we're set at that for a long time, we begin to die off. And the mushroom's heat tolerance range in a lot of these for the mycelium run is between about 55 to about 98 degrees, Once they get above 100, you'll find that the whole mass can just die off, and that is a real problem. So these don't have direct sunlight on them because we don't want to have the accident of the bag overheating because they're closed bags. And the space, well, it doesn't need to be as much as that, but 6 bags, again, my whole thing is working in groups of 6 right now, so it works out nice. I could get them slightly closer and maybe squeeze the 7th bag on, but then everything in my stuff is going to be kind of shifted over throughout time. So after that, we'll look at other equipment that's needed. So the next slide talks about a list of various equipments, and I'll let you read that. And I see that there is a question here about, are the issues with contamination due to using coffee grounds, or are there same issues with growing on sawdust? There are the same issues, but they're a different order of magnitude. So with coffee, anything that has been a problem with sawdust is magnified substantially. And with growing oyster mushrooms, as Steve will oftentimes talk about at Camp Mushroom, is that this is a matter of who's on base first. So we want to give our mycelium every opportunity it has to be on base first, because the more bases it covers in there, or the more particles it grows into before anything else can grow into there, the easier it can fight off anything bad that may have come along that you couldn't find. So they are similar issues, they're just multiplied, and I can't tell you how much necessarily they're multiplied by. So I guess the real thing is there any questions about any of these items here? You need to have a seal or some way to close it up. It can be as simple as a seal-a-meal, because I used my old seal-a-meal for a long time. The problem with that is that it overheats, and so that takes too long. We'll look at fans and humidifiers and monitors soon, and some cleaning supplies. So I see that the question is there a preferred temperature range and humidity level that I'm aiming for the incubation space, or is it specific to a species? Okay, if I'm going to be growing pink oyster or a tropical species, I have to have it warmer. So that's a summer mushroom. In the winter, I have the interior thermostat set to 63, and I have floor heat. And so if you've noticed on my shelving, there's a space between the floor and the bottom shelf, because that needs to be there in order for me not to cook my mycelium and create dead bags. I do not, each one of those bags is sealed. It's its own humid environment right there. And when I started this, I got 2 humidifiers thinking I needed to humidify both rooms. It didn't take me but about 2 groups of this to kind of whack myself in the forehead and say, gee whiz, there's no reason that this room is humidified, except that it causes me trouble by keeping it humid in here and creating a wonderful environment of contamination throughout all the surfaces. So no humidity in your inoculating room. The humidity you get in your seroclave room is going to be fluctuating constantly, and you do have to have some way to get the airflow out of there. Otherwise, you will build up a rainforest in that seroclave room really quickly when you blow off the steam. Light is absolutely unnecessary in here. They do not need light here, but in my case, I have them with light because I have windows in the room. I also need to work on the light, so there's the room with light. These are a primary consumer, so when it gets to the point of producing the fruit, we really want to have a minimum amount of light in there so that they can go and take and create the vitamin D that's a selling point for the oyster mushroom. So let's go on here and look at some fans. We have air intake as the next topic. And that slide, yep, Steve's pulling up that slide for me. You'll see that there is a fan. And there's also the fact that I need to keep things as clean as I can. Now, fans, these are investments. It's important to keep your fan clean. But how in the world am I ever going to get into that fan and clean it? The short answer is no way. It is an enclosed item. I chose enclosed fans like this because what you see on the outside is basically a muffler. And above our garage, because this is a bit of an add-on room to a garage, it is, there is a bedroom space that when the college-bound kids come home, they need a little bit of space. They love to be home, but not too close to home anymore. They can stay there. But if these fans didn't have that muffler, it would translate up there and be very noisy. Also, for me, working in there, because I have a hearing loss issue, the vibration from these fans would just drive me insane. And so since I'm more sensitive to vibration from that, these are just sweet things for me. What you see on the bottom left is a HEPA filter. Now there are several types that you can put on a fan, and of course, trial and error. I had one of these on each end so that the air was coming in really nice and clean, and coming out, the thought process was even cleaner if something went wrong. But that was a redundancy that simply gave me too little airflow. And as one time I learned with things that if you don't have airflow in your inoculation room, those are big carbon dioxide engines you're creating, and they will kill themselves by choking and dying without enough new air. So they really do need fresh air in order to keep going. They need to breathe just like I do. So air turnover is really important. I did the math really carefully. I thought I was getting a really big fan for myself. I thought I was over-fanned. And what I found is that, no, I should have gone to the next size up and trusted that things don't work quite according to book. Now, one nice thing about the fact that I have two of these filters now, this is the filter I use on the inoculation room, and it is a HEPA filter. So I have one that's always kept on the shelf in there, and that means it's clean and ready to go. And then I have, when it's ready to utilize that one, well, we have some plastic bags that we picked up from the grocery store that were never open, and so we bring one of those out, and I go in, having showered and I'm nice and clean, turn off the fan motor, and slip this cleaned filter that's been clean and drying for ages in there, and hand that over, plop it in the bag that my husband has, and he goes and unscrews the quick clamp, puts the new fan on, and makes sure it's good and secure, gives a little whack on the pipe, and then I turn the fan motor back on. So it reduces the amount of downtime for the fan, because my inoculation room is right next to my fruiting room, and I don't want blowback coming through any of the seams there. So one of the questions is, how is the fan vented to the outside? Well, we'll get to that in the end, but the main part is air intake. So a garage setting here, I was just pulling in air from the garage itself for the fruiting, or for the inoculation room. Before the fruiting room, I'm actually pulling air in directly from the outside, and that also needs to have a filter on, but I can get by with a much cheaper box filter that I just periodically shut the fan off there, and then pull out the filter that's there, vacuum out and wipe out anything that's hanging out in there, and put a new filter in and clamp it back down. Because that's around 99.8% effective, whereas in the inoculation room, I needed something that was much more effective. So the next slide here gives you a profile view of the air intake fan. And trust me, there is a filter way around on the other side of that, and I'll show you the filter in a minute. So how do you know if there's enough fresh air coming into your inoculation room or your fruiting room? Well, if you can smell carbon dioxide in your inoculation room, that's bad for you. If you're getting a headache when you're working in it, there's not enough oxygen. You have to increase the flow. And in your fruiting room, it's much easier to tell because the thought process isn't what's happening to my body, but what's happening to the fruity body. And those mushrooms will become tall and leggy because, like a plant looking for light, they're going to be a plant looking for oxygen. And yeah, are they a plant or an animal? Other people can go and have that discussion, but it's something good to think about. So you want them growing close to the medium, and you want them growing in clusters. So if they're not doing that, then you're going to have to increase the fan speed there to get more air getting pulled in. Okay, I think we'll go on to the very next one. Now, some of you wanted to know a bit more about air outtake. So on the bottom left, or on that left slide with the green tape, you'll see behind that plastic that there's a very big box behind there. Well, that is one of these boxes I'm talking about. The top right picture shows you that box, and it does have a quick release clamp, and in there it does have a filter that you can pop out. So as it allows the air to go out, but more than anything, I needed to keep the fungal gnats, in this case, from going back into my fruiting room. Otherwise, I wouldn't necessarily need that. So the top right slide is when I was thinking that I needed to have an exhaust fan pulling air out and have a filter. A filter has to be on an exhaust fan so that you don't end up getting that fan completely filled with spore. And that's moist spore. So that moist spore will become very sticky, and it will create a black layer of gunk on any of the filters. What I ended up doing was something that ended up working out for me much better because I was needing all types of little fans in this area to keep air flowing. Finally came across the fact that I'm just going to open a window a crack, which is the bottom right. I'm looking down, and you can see that there's a window that's open a crack. And that allows the air intake that's coming in to flow through my particular facility and get around and tumble in all the nooks and crannies and exit. And I don't need all these additional fans trying to keep this heavy carbon dioxide moving and getting out. Because if you notice this air outtake fan, I didn't have an option to mount it close to the floor, and that's why it failed for me, because carbon dioxide's heavy, and I was just not able to get the carbon dioxide out by using an exit fan. And the more you keep these, any of this equipment clean, the better off you'll be. Now, in the summertime, on this screen, I will put the same thing that I have on the left slide, and that is your lightest row cover that's available for agricultural row covers. And the importance of that is the screens have big holes, but typically there is so much airflow going out that stuff doesn't blow back into it. However, when pleasing beetle season comes along and spores go out, they signal with all of their might, their flagging, their fireworks, everything to a pleasing beetle that over here, there is spores. Come on and visit. Your food source is ready, your banquet set. Smaller ones can crawl through that screen, which is something you just don't want. Also, any of those little nooks and crooks around the corners and edges of the screen, if it's not fitting tight, otherwise they can crawl right in through that too. Trust me, they've done it. Then the pleasing beetle is what I can't cope with for a bug outside, for growing oyster mushrooms outside. I just have a really low tolerance for bugs. So it's important to know your tolerance level for everything to determine what to do and how you can get it done. So let's talk now about cleaners. So the next slide talks about isopropyl and cleaners. And these are the things that are really good and helpful to use. Now, the first thing a person thinks about with organic and cleaners is that there's an oxymoron there. Well, cleaners, there are a lot of them that are labeled OMRI and they're certified. So those things use. And some of these cleaners we run into constantly when we come across food. Chlorine dioxide is used continuously in the food industry to get rid of contamination. And it's OMRI, so if you've picked up organic produce, it has probably been treated with chlorine dioxide. Another one is there's a little blue tablet that you can get that works as a great sanitizer, and you can get that from any restaurant supply store. And that, almost all of us have had our glasses rinsed in that at restaurants, unless you're at a really high-end restaurant that sanitizes their glassware before they put it on the shelf. If they're doing the 3 rinse method there behind the bar, that last rinse, it's getting rinsed in this stuff. And that's why you might taste it. But that kills a lot of bacteria as well. And when it comes to keeping things clean, it's important to mix it up and shake it up quite frequently. Otherwise, you might be just killing off one of the same things and not irritating and annoying all the different bad things at different times. So here's a picture now of the oxine, which is the chlorine dioxide. So the next slide shows that, and that I just use a 2-gallon sprayer. This is something to mix outside, and oxine is nothing to mess with when you're spraying it, but it is, again, OMRI. And it's not a lot, so I just put the recipe down for myself so I don't have to keep looking at the fine print. Again, I need a scale that measures out the grams really well, and mix it up according to directions outside, put the top on as it's sitting for its 10 minutes, and then I want to make sure I can fill this thing with the amount of water needed as fast as I can before I put this on, because it's water activated as well, and it will produce a huge amount of gas quickly. Now, think about personal protective equipment, what you need, what you're comfortable with. If you breathe this in and don't wear a mask and you breathe it in, it will damage your lungs. There's no doubt about that. You can read about it. So always think about your lung protection. And oftentimes if you protect your lungs, you're going to be protecting everything else in your system. A slide after that is going to show humidification. I don't have a lot of patients to babysit, so I have a humidistat. And this is a cheap one because the next level up is what you do if you have a large operation. And the level down from that is you keep kind of checking on things, and if it's raining, you have to change things. But what I can do then is it automatically shuts off my humidifier. So let's go to the next slide. There's just a few slides left now. Here's a humidifier at work, and the floor will get wet when it's at work. but then it'll dry out in between things. If it's getting moist on the walls or the windows look like you're getting a tropical rainforest, your shoes that you have in there are getting wet, all those are indications you need to back off the humidity. But most importantly is if you start seeing orange grow on your mushrooms, then you've got too much humidity. Also, it's time to hit the whole room with chlorine dioxide, and you can dump the last of the chlorine dioxide in this humidifier to really get into everything in the room. So the Goldilocks sweet spot, it's elusive. The next slide shows my other very high-tech way of catching the water that inevitably collects on a fan when it's in motion. I put one of those blue sanitizing tabs in there, and it keeps that nice sterile water bath below that I can dump periodically. And depending on just what's going on in the season, the weather, it depends on how I tilt the fan speed I have it on. But now I only need one fan. And yes, I'm the only person in there, so I can have the fan guard off. But if I was having an employee, this is not OSHA acceptable. But it's also a plastic blade that's very easy to stop with your finger and not do much other than say one or two words. So the water's colored blue again because I know that it has a sanitizer tab in. I also periodically, like once every 2 weeks, will throw one of those sanitizer tabs into the humidifier just to keep things clean. Let's get on to the harvesting. That's the good part. That's the next slide. Now, again, as a broken record, how do you get dirts and contaminants in there? Well, you can walk in after you've mixed up stuff to a Steroclave and you're pretty dirty. So better to walk in there when you're cleaner. You have your pair of slip-on shoes. Don't go in there just after you've rummaged through the refrigerator and thrown out your old moldy bread. Bad idea. Make sure to have a face mask on because you want to protect your lungs. Those spores are small and you want to keep them out of your life. And then you just snap off the mushrooms when they look nice and ready to harvest. Let's go to the last slide here. And this is what everybody's hoping for when you grow mushrooms. Each one of these holds about 5 pounds of mushrooms. Currently, I'm only able to sell about 8 to 10 pounds at the Chamberlain market I go to. And oftentimes it's about a similar thing locally. I lost my restaurant outlet because there's now an organic mushroom farm up in Rochester that is a large farm that can supply mushrooms through a third vendor, which is selling them for $6 a pound. So it's important to keep in mind that it's challenging to get those high prices, but my mushrooms I can get a higher price when they're growing on coffee than growing on sawdust because they do taste very different. They just have a lot more flavor and that umami flavor that a person can oftentimes go for. So at this point, are there any questions? How are the fans vented to the outside? Well, in the slide that I showed that had the green tape and that little piece of cloth, there's actually 2 of those in the inoculation room. They're below the table that I work on, and that keeps them out of the way so I don't kick them and dislodge them. That way they're nice and stable on the ground. They are tagged down pretty good, but yet if I had them in the way of rolling carts, it could be a problem. They let the air out quite well, which is what's needed. And certainly one of those goes right into my, my fruiting room. So that carbon dioxide air adds to the airflow I need to come in fresh to my fruiting room. And it's one of those calculations I didn't take into account. So if I had to do it over again, I would be one size up on my fan for that room. And it's also much cheaper and easier to have gotten the 8-inch fan than to get the 6-inch fan. But then larger fans, larger noise. Any other questions?